Hi everyone, my name's Ryan H. Lewis, and today we're going to look at the newest version of Webpack. That's Webpack version 5. I'm going to go over the 5 biggest changes that I've found. We'll talk about how to migrate, and then I'll share my experiences migrating one of my projects from Webpack version 4 to Webpack version 5. All right, so Webpack version 5 brings a ton of new features, changes, deprecations, all sorts of things. The release article was 10,000 words. I did not read the whole thing. And I almost wouldn't expect you to either, unless maybe you are a plugin author or a loader author or someone else who is doing some very, very deep things with Webpack. I think if you're a regular user, I think you can probably get the hits. This video is going to be a good step in that direction, but you know, looking at the article and reading some of the top level major changes is a good idea. It's been 2 years. It's been more than 2 years. So February 2018 is when Webpack version 4 came out, and now we're at November. Well, Webpack version 5 came out last month. So Webpack version 5 came out October 2020. So that's over 2 years that Webpack was adding new features, making changes, putting warnings behind soon to be deprecated parts of Webpack. And then finally Webpack version 5 was launched. And so there's a lot in there. Webpack is a very active open source project. And so there's just a ton, 10,000 words. Good luck if you try to read it. But in this video, we're going to break down the top 5. So let's look at the top 5 major changes that I found while I was reading the documentation and trying things out. The first big change in Webpack version 5 is that anything that was deprecated, anything that was warned that it was being deprecated in version 4 has actually been removed, which means that if you were getting deprecation warnings and either you didn't see them because of some setting in your configuration file, or because you just ignored them, or maybe it was running on your CI server and you never saw them to begin with, well, then you are going to have a very rude awakening when you come to version 5, because all of those things that were still worked, but were deprecated in version 4 are completely removed in version 5, and your build is just going to completely break. So there is a trace deprecation flag that you can add to your Webpack builds, which will actually give you the information on what is actually being deprecated and in which plugin or loader the deprecation is taking place. So if you are trying to do your upgrade and migrate to version 5, you can use that trace deprecation flag to really find out what is actually deprecated, because you know what the Webpack output looks like. It looks like insanity. The second big change in Webpack version 5 is that a lot of the functionality of some plugins and loaders have been rolled into Webpack core. And so in Webpack version 4, they did this with a lot of the optimization plugins. And in Webpack version 5, they did the same thing. Basically, I'm thinking that the thought process behind this is that there were plugins that really kind of everyone was using, and they just felt like it made more sense to roll it into the core framework. They're probably able to make some optimizations with those plugins as well, that when it was kind of like an external plugin, they weren't necessarily able to. Some examples are, let me look. Named modules plugin, named chunks plugin, and hashed modules plugin, to name a few things that I don't think I've used those plugins before. But if you have, now you will use them. They are configuration properties instead of plugins that you have to install separately. The third big change in Webpack version 5 is that node polyfills are no longer included. What's a node polyfill? Well, if you know what a polyfill is, you probably have heard it in reference to the browser, because polyfills were popular, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, to polyfill in JavaScript features that were not in older versions of Internet Explorer. The polyfills that we're talking about here in Webpack are basically polyfills for the node common modules, Node core library that doesn't exist in the browser. And so these Webpack polyfills enable you to use things that are in Node, like some of the things that were removed are the process object and the buffer object. Both of those were removed in Webpack version 5. Previously, there was a Webpack polyfill that basically, if someone was calling one of those things in either your own code or in a dependency, an NPM module that you were using, it would use that polyfill. But because basically they said at this point, most modules are built for the browser, they don't use those things anymore. They basically found that it was easier to remove them, reduce the code base, and things like that. When they had them in there, it's because a lot of NPM modules were actually not for the browser yet, because when NPM originally was really used for Node. And so now that NPM is kind of used for JavaScript as a whole, they don't need to do these Node polyfills because a lot of modules don't expect them anymore. The fourth big change in Webpack version 5 is actually a bunch of tiny changes. Think death by 1,000 cuts. The configuration, which you're all well aware of if you're using Webpack, that webpack.config.js file that you build and maintain and change maybe once every couple years whenever you're upgrading your version of Webpack. There are over 100 new or changes to properties in that Webpack configuration file. And I will not name them all here. Probably if you use all 100 of these things or plan to use all 100 of these things, I feel like you deserve a medal. There's a ton in there. When I was looking through, there were a few things that I recognize that I've used before, but honestly, there was a ton of stuff that I have just never seen, never touched, probably never will touch. In addition to new, either like changed names to properties or new properties or new kind of handling of properties where maybe before it was a string, now it's an object. There's also new defaults. So these properties that you may not be actually using, before they had one default behavior, now they have another default behavior. And so usually what I've seen is it's stuff that is not kind of on the main path of Webpack. But if you're interested and you have a lazy Saturday time to crunch this 10,000 word article, you can look through and just see if it's anything that you may be interested in. The fifth big change to Webpack version 5 is that it requires Node version 10. So although this is not a huge change to the Webpack user experience, this is one of those things, just from my experience working on teams, that will probably require you to make some changes. The reason why is that a lot of times that I have been running these continuous integration servers that actually run Webpack in the cloud or on some third-party service to be able to kind of build my application. A lot of times the Node version on that server or whatever it is, instance, is really out of date. It doesn't get updated like the Node version on my computer. Usually the Node version on my computer is whatever the most current LTS version is, just because I love to check out the new features. If the current LTS is too far from like the application that I'm working on and whatever the Node version is on the servers in the cloud that application is running on, well, then I'll usually kind of stick my Node version to that. I use NVM, so I can switch Node versions really easily, but I'll set that as my default. But if I'm running Webpack in something like Circle CI or Code Build in AWS, well then the Node version that's running in there is probably going to be old, or at least I will try to match it to the application. Now, let's say you are like probably most people out there and you haven't had time, or your project manager or your product manager hasn't given you permission to take the time to actually upgrade the Node version for that application, or you're just a little afraid to, which I don't blame you, then you may find that what's running on your CI server is something like Node version 6 or version 8. And so now that Webpack 5 is requiring Node version 10, which granted is not even the current, like Node version 14 is the current LTS version. So this is a couple years old. But I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people are going to find roadblocks to upgrading to Webpack version 5 with this Node version requirement. Now, I think it's a great idea that they did this. I'm a little surprised they didn't go past version 10, but just be aware that's a big change, and it makes it, potentially more difficult to use Webpack in this case, but something I support. All right, so I wanted to go over the upgrade process, the migration process from version 4 to version 5. Hopefully you're already on version 4 and you're not moving from 3 to 5, because version 4 had a lot more breaking changes in the configuration file structure. Version 5 doesn't have nearly as many, but there's a couple things that is interesting. So because version 5 is so new, just came out last month, first of all, you may not want to migrate. I mean, what you're getting from version 5, I would say at this point may not be worth it. Probably once the entire ecosystem gets kind of upgraded to version 5, then it might make more sense. But if you're like me, and if you're like many projects, you probably use many different plugins and loaders in your Webpack configuration file. And so if you do this, you really need to go through, first of all, you have to go through and upgrade all of your plugins and loaders. That could be a lot. Second of all, you need to check all of those plugins and loaders and make sure that they actually even support version 5. If you use something that's in the Webpack project, one of the Webpack contrib plugins, then you're probably safe. But some of the third-party plugins that are, you maybe found a plugin or a loader out there that just did exactly what you needed it to, and unfortunately, it's maintained by some person who, I don't know, they lost their computer for the past year. Those are going to be a little tougher because they may not support the changes in version 5. And that's the thing, is version 5, a lot of the changes, because there are a lot of changes to the internals, are deep. And so the loaders and plugins, they are going to have the most changes for these kinds of things. If you're an end user of Webpack, I went through the 5 major changes, and you may have gone through all 5 and said, I'm already on Node version 10. I don't have to do any of these things. I don't use any of these plugins that have changed. So you may be totally fine with all of these changes. But all of your loaders and plugins may not. So what you want to do is you want to go through and check every loader and plugin. You want to upgrade it if it's got a new version. If it doesn't have a new version, you may need to look for a beta of that plugin, or you may need to look for a new plugin, or just wait to upgrade. One side benefit of doing this check is that you may find plugins that have been deprecated or are no longer supported. I did that when I was going through this process, and I was using this optimized CSS assets Webpack plugin. I don't know where I got it, probably reading some tutorial, but basically it was deprecated. They said use this other thing instead. So I learned that during this process, which is good. I mean, I probably haven't upgraded the kind of Webpack, the build for this project in 2 years. So I'm not surprised that something in there is deprecated. The other thing you should do before you upgrade is to use that trace deprecations flag in Webpack when you're still on version 4. That will let you know, even after you have kind of done all of these upgrades for your loaders and plugins, what is still kind of lingering, what isn't going to work when you upgrade to version 5. The other thing that you can do is you can just create a new Git branch and just do the upgrade to Webpack. You upgrade Webpack, you upgrade Webpack-CLI, and then you upgrade You probably need to upgrade your Babel loader if you're using Babel, and any of your other loaders and plugins. And once you do that, then you run your build again and you can see what has changed. You can see if it actually works. I mean, that would be amazing if you just upgraded Webpack and it just immediately worked. I wouldn't be surprised if that did not happen. That has never happened for me. So yeah, so that's really the installation process, the migration process from Webpack version 4 to Webpack version 5. So I wanted to share my experience migrating one of my projects from Webpack version 4 to Webpack version 5. And this is not a production app. It's not huge or anything, but I feel like there's a little complexity in the build. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that and kind of show the project to you. So you can see here, this is my Webpack config. There's not too much going on. There's not a lot of loaders. There's really just some CSS. I use less. It's going through Babel. I'm doing a little chunk splitting and some optimization, minimization. But beyond that, there's not a ton going on. And basically, let's see, when I run this, it is running, and you may have noticed that ran really, really quickly. That is a half-second Webpack build. That may surprise you, but that's a result of this new configuration feature, and that's the file system cache. This is a new thing that, as far as I understand, was not available in Webpack version 4. If I comment it out, you'll see that the build takes quite a bit longer. It's actually about a 4.5-second build. So with that file system cache, which as far as I understand, the way that it works, it caches things in the cache folder of the Webpack folder in your Node modules folder. So by running that, you can see the build is crazy, crazy fast. Now, again, this is not a huge project. If you had a huge project, I feel like with this file system cache, you would still see gains like this. And that's really, really impressive. Another thing that I found is that I currently run it in production mode just for everything, but if you run it in development mode, it's actually significantly faster. And one of the reasons that I found that was this is probably true of Webpack version 5, but at least in this is probably true in Webpack version 4, but at least in Webpack version 5, the production mode is because it's building out these source maps. I was previously using something like cheap source map, and it ended up being a very slow process. Using this eval, it is much, much faster for these source maps. It might not be the best thing for running on the client, but at least in the build, it's the fastest. So, those are really the changes. Some of the other changes that I had to do was I was using Uglify.js. I had to use a Terser plugin, and there were a few things that I just removed because they weren't up to date anymore. I also noticed that the Webpack package is actually larger in Webpack version 5 than version 4. I think I may have done something when I was upgrading, when I was modifying my file and adding some things in. I think that when I was changing a loader or removing some of the loaders, it did something that has made the package bigger, because in the Webpack release notes it says that it's supposed to be much better performance. And so I would just say overall, Webpack version 5 has been pretty awesome. I feel like if you have a simple build like mine, it is probably something you could jump to right away. If you have a very complicated build, some custom loaders or plugins, you might want to wait on version and stay on version 4 until you've got time to really put into the upgrade. Either way, that file system cache is pretty sweet, isn't it? So you may want to think about putting that time in. It may be worth it in the long run if you're development time is significantly better. The other cool thing with that file system cache is that if you're using something, some kind of continuous integration, and you're caching your node modules folder in there, which is something that I always did on mine, then that cache will also be applied to your Webpack build since it's in the node modules folder. So that's really cool. All right, well, that was the 5 biggest things in Webpack version 5. I also went through a migration guide and my own experiences. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more videos on Webpack or things like AWS or JavaScript. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.